Hello and welcome to today's webinar from Real Story Group. My name is Scott Dill. I'm joined by my colleagues Tony Byrne and Apoorv Durga for today's presentation on web content management in a post-DXP world. We got our start as a firm following the web content management technology marketplace 21 years ago and still following it with rigor today. So I know Tony and Apoorv are excited to walk you through today's presentation of what that marketplace looks like moving forward. I just wanted to mention a couple of quick housekeeping items of note here as we get started. There will be time for questions at the end, so if you do have any questions, you can enter those into the questions tab and then go to webinar control panel, which should be on the right side of your screen. And also, you will be able to access these slides in a couple of days, so keep an eye out and an email from a marketing team with the slides from today's presentation. And for our subscribers on the line, you'll be able to access a recording of today's presentation in your subscriber library within the next couple of days. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Tony and Apoorv to get things started. Guys.
Great, thanks, Scott. We know on average about half of you are familiar with Real Story Group. For the other half, we want to just tell you that we're a different kind. We're an analyst firm, but we're a different kind of analyst firm, which is we only work on the buy side of the marketplace, which means we only work for buyers of technology. And it turns out this is a somewhat unique story in the analyst world. In fact, I founded the firm really in reaction to being a developer in the late 90s and early 2000s myself, working on web applications and finding that the so-called magical quadrants were not so magical after all. And I thought there ought to be a better way to tell the real story on how different technologies work or don't work. So when I started the analyst firm, it was really with some strict rules that, again, I think are very unique in the industry. We never consult the vendors, we never advise them. We don't speak at their events. We don't accept any hospitality. We don't write white papers. All we do is focus on you, the technology buyer. And as Scott mentioned, we actually started out life as CMS Watch, evaluating web content management vendors, ultimately growing that to about 30 vendors, which is about how many we evaluate today. That's the blue line on this subway map, which we've just updated. Over time, as we evolved into becoming Real Story Group, we started covering a number of other adjacent technologies like digital asset management, email and marketing automation, and then that led to a number of other marketplaces, including journey orchestration, customer data platforms, marketing attribution, personalization platforms, most recently now e-commerce platforms. A lot of this is driven by you. Those of you who are subscribers are kind of telling us what you want us to evaluate, and so we listen to you, and we've built out this map accordingly. But today we're going to focus on the blue line, but it's interesting, and you can see all the different intersections here. You can't really tell the story about the light blue or web content and experience management line, the WCM line. You can't really tell that story without also telling the story of what are some things happening in these other spaces, because that's really driving a lot of change in web content management and some new opportunities for you as well. So let's get into it. So first, we're going to just dispense with this whole idea of DXP. We'll talk about its birth and then its almost immediate expiration as a concept. And to do that, we'll do it through the traditional analyst approach, which is for reference models. So you should always expect that any analyst firm should be able to share with you reference models, which is their view of the world. And that helps you. You probably heard the emergency vehicle go by. That helps you, instead of going from crisis to crisis to crisis and emergency to emergency, to instead have kind of a long-term plan around what your technology stack is going to look like. And so, in the early 2000s, when we were just starting what was then CMS Watch, this was our kind of reference model for a web content management system. It was basically content in and content out. And the library system, CMS served as both a library and also a kind of a factory, still does today. And even from the beginning of CMS time in the late 1990s, it was designed at least for sort of a multi-channel world. There was the advent of wireless devices, syndication typically built in from the beginning, generating PDF files, all sorts of things. So this was kind of our view of the world for that decade. But then, of course, the whole digital landscape expanded, and this was a reference model that Real Story Group used with our subscribers in the 2010s, at least the first half of the 2010s, where there was a whole panoply of different channels emerging, a variety of production, interaction, delivery services in play here, portals, e-commerce starts to rise. You have the rise of CDNs and OVPs, mobile middleware, testing, so forth. But then you have this content and engagement management tier, this colored tier here, which web content management was important, but there were a number of other engagement and touch points that also became important. WCM became really just kind of one, arrow in your quiver. And then, then this whole notion of trying to deal with what was then really your kind of customer data soup and how do we do all of that. And so it became a much more complex landscape. And the web content management vendors, and especially the so-called portal vendors, really decided that they needed to take kind of a different approach to growth, which was to try to acquire or sometimes build capabilities in these adjacent spaces. So building a DAM or buying a DAM, building an email marketing platform, building a social engagement tool, maybe even building or acquiring an e-commerce platform. And of course, they needed an acronym for that. So the name they came up with was Digital Experience Platform. Now, the interesting thing about digital experience platforms, or DXP, is that they never actually really existed in the real world. It was an entirely abstract concept that never ever came to life. In other words, there was no vendor who actually rolled out a digital experience platform. But there is this analyst vendor echo chamber where Forrester and Gartner and others would do DXP Magic Quadrants with this idea that if you get your web content management system from the likes of Sitecore or Adobe, you should also buy their XYZ products, and that somehow these were put together greater than the sum of the parts. In reality, of course, as you know, very often that the agglomeration of different tools was actually less than the sum of the parts. And really by the end of this decade, we saw, going into the 2020s, that this whole concept of DXP really has gotten largely shelved. And we understand now that there is a much more sophisticated MarTech stack that needs to be addressed here. And really, one of the driving considerations of this, and really the great challenge of the 2020s, is that your customers are expecting to to interact with you in a variety of different channels. And one of the interesting things that our customer council is telling us is that the pandemic really accelerated this. Their customers were showing up in all kinds of new and different digital environments, a lot more emphasis on direct-to-consumer e-commerce, for example. And so this whole notion of consumers having isolated, disjointed experiences became increasingly intolerable. But, there's a variety of reasons for that. But there was a really important structural reason, which is that we built up all of these different engagement silos with separate platforms that each had their own content, each had their own data, each had their own rules, each had their own planning, and each had their own analytics. And so if you were going to do personalization or testing in one of these, you couldn't necessarily do that across all of them. And so customers started to have, extremely divergent experiences. And really the only way out of this that we see, and many of our subscribers are working hard towards this, is this notion of having some foundation services. So, you take a look at omni-channel operations, unified customer data, which is really table stakes for this, some degree of journey orchestration and decisioning, even if it's very simple at first. That we're seeing the rise, albeit very slow rise, of the notion of omni-channel content, which is really different from web content management. And then, of course, all of it underpinned by customer intelligence, so that you can deliver relevant options for your customers. And so the reference model that we use for the 2020s looks like this. There's a lot going on here, and you can see other recorded webinars that we've done that describe what this particular layer cake here. But there's a couple of key takeaways. One is that many of you are investing with good reason in enterprise foundation services that you can apply across your stack. And so that means that inevitably these services are decoupled from the engagement services that live above them. They're necessarily decoupled from the engagement services that live above them. And there's a lot going on here. You've got 3 different columns down at the bottom. First of all, content and information management, very germane to us with respect to digital asset management, product information management, and what we call omni-channel content services. The data column in the middle, obviously critically important. We have a lot to say about that you can find from us elsewhere. And then decisioning, this notion of having omni-channel decisioning, but whether it's from optimization, personalization, or full-blown journey orchestration. Now, you still have these colored engagement management services in the middle tier, but the point is that the scope of these is now changing in this new world, and it's been slowly changing over the course of the last decade, which is accelerating now, and now as we're getting into the mid-2020s, where these become more sort of forward-looking services, and they're more sort of order takers rather than decision makers. And the good news is that can mean that you can often get away with lighter, more modern technologies at this tier, because you're not asking them to do a lot of vertically integrated services like they used to do in their own silo. So this has really a lot of implications, and you'll notice that web content management here, from being at the center of the digital universe 20 years ago to being, a key part of your stack 10 years ago, to now being just one box among many, that's deliberate. Having said that, I'm not suggesting that this is somehow unimportant, that the content that you're producing both for your sort of static marketing websites as well as the content you're producing maybe for applications and other environments is unimportant, but rather in relative terms, it's being overtaken by the sheer breadth of other touch points above and beyond web content management. So this is kind of the structural assumptions that we're making. And you can feel free to use this reference model yourself. When we're working with our subscribers, we often very heavily customize it for your particular environment. Again, this is a generic reference model, but it's a really good way to look at, what is your as-is situation relative to your to-be situation. But the key thing here is that this is a composable stack as well. So not everybody can make a leap and get here tomorrow. Instead, you start sort of plugging in different Lego pieces and then get you to this new sort of omni-channel world. But again, with respect to web content management, it means a very different set of scope here for web content management than certainly the early days of WCM, and certainly through this somewhat absurd vision of a DXP. So this has three critical implications for you, the WCM customer. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Apoorv here to talk through those. I wanted to remind you again that you have access to the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. And sure, you can ask us questions. You can also make comments or maybe challenge something we have to say or share a vignette or anything else that's on your mind. We'll certainly have time at the end to address that. So Apoorv, let's look at really implication number one.
Thank you, Tony. So let's look at what the new reference architecture means for content management. Recall that the key takeaway from that model is to have a foundational layer that consists of really foundational capabilities for content, data, and decisioning. What that means is that essentially what we are suggesting is that you make your foundation layer heavy and move some of the capabilities from your engagement layer to your foundation layer. So essentially you make your top layers light and make your bottom layers heavy. Therefore, some of the capabilities such as content reuse or component content management, etc., move from your WCM tools in engagement layer to foundational services lower in your stack. This makes your engagement layer more agile, simple, and lightweight. In terms of tooling, this means that you replace heavyweight tools with relatively lightweight and more agile WCM or CMS tools. Because the difference between heavyweight tools and relatively simpler tools is much more narrower now, right? So that's the first implication. And that brings us to this architectural issue and notion of headless and composable tools, right? So several vendors are selling their headless tools, calling them essential for your composable martech stack. Right now, of course, developers love headless products because they are relatively more developer friendly, have modern APIs, and give more power to them. But often your marketing people, or for that matter, editorial people, are not really happy with that. They still need a more visual way to create pages, preview them, and generally focus a bit more on experience, something that purely headless tools won't allow them. So we think the best option is really to have a hybrid solution that provides both traditional page-like capabilities as well as headless capabilities. So in that sense, headless is really a product feature rather than a product in itself. Or in other words, headless can be one of the use cases among several other use cases. Now, most traditional CMS vendors will claim that they have headless capabilities, and headless vendors are starting to build experience management chops, but not many of them do a good job at both. On your part, don't get swayed by religious discussions around headless architecture. You need both. And so coming back to the third implication, and coming back to the theme of having content as a key part of foundational layer, there's a new category of products emerging. We call them omni-channel content platforms, or OCPs. This is a very young market and in some ways still immature. Many of these products have roots in digital asset management or DAM technologies, and so they treat digital assets as first-class managed objects, obviously. But in addition to that, they also treat data as first-class managed objects, and they do it all independently of any specific engagement channel. So think product information or content fragments for your campaigns or paragraphs for your email. Now, these products provide you granular capabilities to manage these content and data fragments along with rich media and brand assets. And since this is part of foundational layer, it all these tools feed all these type of content into multiple channels upstream, including your WCM. So your WCM is still there, but is more focused on relatively simpler use cases, or those that require, for example, stories or pages or static pages and things like that. But all your usable content is now part of this foundational services layer. Again, most WCM vendors will claim they can do all this too, but we recommend you remain skeptical of those claims. So the key takeaway is that while your WCM is still important, it may not be as important as it used to be earlier, especially if you move to an architecture which has foundational components for content as Tony described. So let's look at the marketplace, and over to you, Tony, for taking us through the marketplace.
Thanks. That's a great description. And I think of among the three here, this one maybe is the most aspirational and the one that's still very much under construction. So that's the one caveat we want to give, that even though we think this is where the world is going, it's moving here slowly, because this is complicated stuff to abstract out your content. I think there's been more urgency around abstracting and pulling back and decoupling the data, customer data, from some of these engagement services and putting it into something like a CDP. Content is a little bit trickier, but we're starting to see some good use cases emerge. Okay, so the WCM marketplace is evolving in this context, so this is our view of the WCM marketplace. With mature marketplaces like WCM and digital asset management, we tend to look at them on a complexity spectrum. There's a lot of different ways you can slice and dice vendors in marketplaces, but in a two-dimensional screen where we're putting things into boxes, as we should as analyst firms, then we think that for mature marketplaces, a complexity spectrum is typically the best way to evaluate them. And so we're not making a value judgment here. In fact, I tend to think that, in fact, that if you can go with a less complex system, your life is going to be much better in the long run. So this isn't a value judgment. It's just the way it pans out, that there are different levels of complexity that the market needs. It's interesting, the digital asset management marketplace, which is also getting a little longer in the tooth, also falls out in the complexity spectrum, and the CDP marketplace is also evolving into a complexity spectrum. So that's interesting. So you've got toolkits on the one hand where with enough time, money, and ibuprofen, you can do pretty much whatever you want. And then you have going all the way over to the right, mid-range tools, which still almost always require a developer. So if you don't have a developer, then you should probably look to the right of this chart, which would be off the chart, which would be sort of site builders like Squarespace and others, which have really taken out the bottom of the market. So that's an interesting thing that's happened in the last 10 years, is that these so-called site builders like Wix and Squarespace and others have really removed the whole bottom end of the market. And so we're talking about the WCM marketplace. We're talking about still sort of developer necessary tools ranging from mid-range through to upper range. And then, of course, you've got legacy platforms grayed out in the bottom. Those are platforms that you leave rather than license afresh. So it's a broad marketplace. Traditional analyst firms have not done a good job of covering this marketplace. For legacy and other reasons, we tend to see more platform as a service rather than multi-tenant software as a service. It depends. Obviously, the younger vendors tend to be more SaaS-oriented. It turns out many enterprises seem to like platform as a service because they want to have a lot more control over a number of different things in this space. There's still significant competition, so that's good. The competition revolves, a lot around usability and fitness to purpose for different use cases, as well as editorial models. Are they more component-oriented? Are they more component-oriented? Are they more page-oriented? That sort of thing. That relates to some extent on, the architectural debates that people have about headless versus non-headless. And again, to Apoor's point, head optional, we think it's going to be the winning model here. But the key thing that's happened, we believe, is this kind of squeeze from the top, that the difference between what a toolkit can offer and what a mid-range platform can offer has narrowed. And the toolkits in particular, and to some extent some of the upper range platforms like Acquia and Liferay, really put all their marbles in the DXP sort of gambit, where they were going to sell you a number of different tools under the same logo, including a web content management platform that probably is too heavyweight for what you need today in the world. So I think that's where we're seeing a lot of reexamination of, do I really need something as heavy as Adobe and Episerver? And Sitecore itself, as you probably know, has given up on its flagship XP platform, which was this omnibus, huge, complicated, if rich and robust web content management system that also had a number of other things baked in. So what are some of the key takeaways for 2022? That should be in 2023. So we are looking forward here, not backwards. That's a typo on our behalf. So I think that the largest CMS vendors have kind of dropped the ball in pursuit of their DXP dreams. And I think that they have been overtaken by some lighter weight solutions that are going to fit better in your MarTech stack. That doesn't mean that if you're licensing Adobe or Acquia today that you should head for the exits, but I think that you are maybe missing an opportunity to have a more simpler, more agile solution at that tier. The top of the market, as I mentioned, is overstretched horizontally and overweighted with technical debt and complexity. But the good news is that in the meanwhile, the scope of web content management has narrowed in the broader MarTech stack. And in particular, there's a meta trend around externalizing what were previously bundled WCM services around content operations, A/B testing and optimization, personalization, certainly analytics, digital asset management, and other component assets, so on and so forth, that are now better handled by an adjacent tool, probably a tier lower in your stack, that not just is providing those services to your web content management or your website environment, but also to all of your other digital environments. Now, a number of vendors are kind of backpedaling out of the DXP world by saying, well, we offer a composable DXP. In other words, you can mix and, pick from our potpourri of different fruits here. You can get an orange and 2 apples, or not buy the peach, and so on and so forth. And you want to be really careful about that, because just because a vendor has acquired these different tools doesn't mean that they make sense together. Most of the acquisitions that we've seen don't make sense. And so really, there's no need to buy the same, the adjacent solution from the same vendor. There's no guarantee that it's going to be just as integrated. So you definitely want to look at the full scope of your options here. Again, remain cautious about headless only. This has become a religious debate in an ecumenical world where headless is a feature and not an end in itself. But one of the most interesting things about this, and we haven't talked a lot about it, but it's been kind of an undercurrent of the last 20 minutes or so, is that we see a kind of back to basics of managing digital content more effectively. I think as the bloat and the expansion of web content management services over in particularly in the decade of the 2010s, got us away a little bit from thinking about the quality of our content, the suitability of our content, and now from a web content management perspective, I think it's by narrowing the scope and asking these platforms to do less, we're really focusing on the more important things, which are is our content doing what we need it to do? And that's a critical question you can never stop asking yourself. And I think some of the more agile solutions that are on the market today really are going to help you be more adaptive as you learn, what works and what doesn't work. So if you haven't worked with Real Story Group before, there's 3 ways that you can work with us. The first is you can license like our web content management technology stream. That gets you access to a number of tools, including the Real Quadrant shortlist generator, which allows you to input some of your requirements and weight different considerations and generate a custom shortlist and a custom quadrant that works just for you and all the associated research and documentation and graphics to help you make your case. Some of our subscribers go for a full stack subscription, which means they get access to all the research on all of these different vendors that you see on this map. And we also advise them then in their overall MarTech stack, share some of our reference models, help them make good decisions from a stack perspective. And then a subset of those companies join our exclusive customer-only MarTech Leadership Council. We'll be meeting next in St. Louis. Very excited about that. About 35 people from about 20 different companies are going to be joining us, all large enterprises, where we are going to share what we're doing with our stacks, what are some best practices, a lot of conversations around marketing operations, around personalization, rethinking email, a number of things that are going on out there in the world. We're going to be sharing with each other and super looking forward to that. So if that's of interest, Scott can tell you just how to reach out and what the next steps are, and he'll spend a minute on that while we review the questions.
Absolutely, and there is a form to apply for the Executive Council that Tony mentioned on our website. If you just go to our homepage, you'll see the tab for Council, and you can fill an application to join us in St. Louis in September, and for our subsequent meetings as we've gone to more of a hybrid virtual and in-person model for those council meetings. In terms of our webinar schedule, Tony will be back with us in a couple weeks to talk about selecting the right CDP technology. So if you're thinking about customer data platforms, I would certainly invite you to participate in that as well. And as always, you can download samples from web content management and the rest of our research looking at the website that's listed right there. So with that, I have seen a number of questions come in. So Tony and Apoorv, we'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, the first question is from Christina. So she's asking, I like the idea of shifting services from engagement to enterprise foundation. Can you explain the slide showing the arrows to Adobe, Acquia, and Sitecore further? So I'll say a few words, and then Apoorv, maybe you can jump in. So, Adobe, Acquia, Sitecore, Episerver have a lot of, I would say, brand awareness in the marketplace and a legacy of some longstanding implementations. So, and they are among the more complex implementations and expensive high TCO implementations as well. And so we're basically suggesting, look, these don't default to these. And in fact, they may prove too heavy because of the services that they bundle that now in your stack are getting decoupled from web content management. You have an opportunity to focus more on some lighter weight, more agile tools that might help you then focus more on content. Apoorv, anything to add there?
I think you covered it. Nothing to add.
Okay, great. So Gary's asking a couple of questions about the marketplace Where does Kentico fit in? So Kentico has a couple of products. They have their legacy product, which originally started on-prem, which we would put as a mid-range, probably lower mid-range platform here. We stopped getting inquiries about it, so we removed it from our coverage. Then there's Content.io, which they have spun off as a separate company, and it's a pure play headless platform, which again we're a little bit skeptical about. If there's demand for it, we'll start covering it again. And Gary's also asking about Oracle here. What about Oracle Content Manager? Do you call that legacy along with Oracle Web Center? So down here in the left for Web Content Management, we have Oracle Web Center, which is kind of a conglomeration of Stellent and some other tools back in the day. But Gary is saying, well, where do we put Oracle Content Manager? So what do we have to say about that?
Yeah, so Oracle has multiple offerings there, right? So one of their new offerings is sort of pure headless, which I think, Tony, we cover in our OCP report.
That's right.
OCP evaluation. So that's one. Then there is Oracle Content, which was their ECM or document management offering based on the acquisition of Stellent, etc. So there are multiple ones there out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, we do cover Oracle Content Manager, but we do in our OCP or Omnichannel Content Platform marketplace. So Jonathan is asking, is it worth mentioning the evolution of WordPress into Elementor Pro and other products because WordPress Gutenberg was late and still behind? You know, it's interesting to watch this. I think, you know, WordPress has not had the equivalent of like an Acquia that's really driving their roadmap. And so there's a lot of different ways that WordPress has gone and could go. And there's pros and cons to that. I tend to think in general that WordPress solves a very important need for a more page-oriented yet rich web content management system. There's a natural tension in that community around people who are basically, you know, the large majority of WordPress deployments that are essentially using it as a site builder for better or worse, and then those who want to do more sophisticated stuff with it. So we're actually updating our WordPress chapter right now. We're doing quite a bit of work on it, and so we'll have probably a better answer in a month or so for you, Jonathan.
But I'd like to add, yeah, I actually agree with the comment that Gutenberg was late in the market, and Elementor or Elementor Pro sort of became default for those who wanted to build pages or experiences by their hand.
Yeah, that's right. So in a sense, I think there's also the issue of maybe different content and editorial operational models at play here. Pam is asking, can we explain the 3 ways to engage with Real Story Group again? So these are basically 3 ways that you can purchase our services, Pam. You can either get access to a single marketplace and our research and us to advise you on the decisions that you're making in our research and various tools, decision-making tools that we have on our website. The second way is to basically license everything and then and then the third way is on top of number 2 to then join our council. Clay is asking, seems like some mid-tier WCM vendors are still trying to solve the DXP all-in-one. Have you seen a reduction in the ability of those players to gracefully interact with externalized vendors? That's a really good question, and I think that the short answer is yes. I think that when we see a mid-tier WCM vendor try to basically be a digital platform in a box, that might work for their lowest end customers, but you know, more and more their customer bases are going to want them to supply a lot of these services externally. And you have these platforms. I think Drupal is one of them, to some extent WordPress, where in theory you have connectors to other platforms, but they tend to want to provide a lot of services just within that environment. And I think that's increasingly untenable in a composable stack world. So Srishant is asking, I'm trying to understand the headless approach better. Why would customers want this when a CMS can deliver a page and easily visualize that way? Wouldn't headless also make the page load slower because of the interaction of the front-end framework? What are the advantages of headless, if any? Well, that's an interesting question. Usually, Srishant, we hear it the other way around, like, what's wrong with headless? Isn't it awesome? And you're sort of saying, and the basic, there's a very powerful use case for headless, which is that sometimes you have to retrofit content services into existing web applications. The big one that everyone talks about is e-commerce. I want to supply content to my e-commerce platform. I don't want my web content management system having a front end that's going to get in the way of that. So I need to supply, and that could be any web application, or if you're doing adaptive mobile or other mobile strategies, you have a native mobile app, or you just want to ship content components and not worry about what's the interface, then that's really the case for headless. Bradley is asking, I'm curious how you all think about products like Unless and Mutiny, which are lighter weight digital personalization tools. They seem to indicate they may site at a different level in the stack, but they don't exactly seem to be foundational omni-channel services. Well, that's a good point. Is that some of these services that are emerging that are adjacent to web content management are lighter weight tooling themselves. But ideally, you could still use like potentially a Mutiny or others across more than just your website. Also use them for web applications, potentially deploy them in an e-commerce environment, that sort of thing. I think the larger point that you're getting at here, Bradley, which is very interesting, is that personalization is getting decoupled from WCM platforms, and there's a lot to be said there, including the role of customer data. Whether you're doing behavioral personalization or profile personalization, do you still want to do server side? There's all kinds of reasons to want to still do server side. So a lot of important technical questions there. We do now evaluate personalization platforms as a separate stream, sort of anticipating this. That's the blue line on our website. We're going to have more to say there over the coming year.
Yeah.
Anything to add there, Apoorv?
Yeah, I was just saying that in our reference architecture, personalization is really part of the decisioning foundational component.
Right. And I think Bradley's point was these guys seem kind of lightweight and maybe not so omni-channel. So what does that mean? And you have to kind of play that out.
Yep.
So Gary's now asking, when you go headless, are you actually running two different web servers, or does developer content also run the same server as the marketing content? Well, I think I think you might be asking about hybrid, and there's no reason in a hybrid platform why they need to be two separate instances or two separate servers. There is, except that there is a front end that needs to be, and so that will probably literally be a separate server. But with respect to content management, ideally in a hybrid environment, you're sort of managing both your headless content and your head full content in the same repository. In fact, in many cases, it may be the same content. Okay, so we ran a little bit late. I think that's just the measure of the energy around this and the great questions that we had. So thanks for participating. Always a pleasure to interact with you and share ideas like this. As Scott mentioned, if you're interested in customer data platforms, the orange line, that webinar is coming up in 2 weeks. So in the meantime, on behalf of Apoorv and Scott and the rest of the RSG team, I want to wish you a great rest of your week. Right. Bye now.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.